How is everybody today? This is Religious Studies 3396, Christianity and Ethics. As you're aware, this is a course which is also being broadcast on ITV. So there are a number of students, in fact the majority of students, will be watching this course on TV. That means that there's some needs that we have here in the classroom to make sure that if we ask questions or if we make any comments, we use the microphone. And in front of you, you have instructions on how to use the microphone. The course instructor will determine how he or she will handle questions, and the way I'll handle questions is when you ask them, I'll deal with them. And I want you to ask questions as often as possible, because this is obviously a complex subject. And it's not a subject that many people have had any study in high school or even other study in college on. And so the readings will be extensive, because from my perspective, the more you can read on a subject, of course you're limited by your time, but the more you can read on a subject, the more you'll be able to roll those ideas around in your head and eventually see an outline of what the subject is trying to say. So I want you to feel free to ask any questions at any time. In fact, that would be very helpful to me, because I don't like to listen to myself through the whole class period. And it would help you if you didn't have to listen to me all the way through. If you ask questions, and then we could bounce off those. And I found that's the best way to understand. And so if you run in, if I say something that you don't comprehend, it may help you to do your reading, but it also will shortcut your learning if you just ask a question about it and we can deal with it. When you use the microphone, you face the microphone, you press and hold the button located on the microphone base, you speak at a normal level, and then you release the button after your question or comment. That may be a little bit more trouble, but it's very important for this class. I'm Lynn Mitchell, by the way, resident scholar in religion at the University of Houston, and coordinator of the Religious Studies program. I've been here since 1985, and since then I've been teaching courses on the Bible and religion. They used to be cultural heritage courses. Now we have a minor, and so you can get a minor in religious studies, whatever your major happens to be. And a lot of people are not aware of the fact that religious studies is something that can be actually dealt with in a state university, because a lot of Americans have kind of a weird concept of what separation of church and state means. And religious studies in a state university is obviously not for the purpose of converting anybody to anything. It's not even directly for the purpose of religious nurture, even though if you read religious material, you may learn some things that have something to do with your own religious ideas and your own religious development and maybe your own spirituality. But the purpose of this course is to understand. That's the purpose of any religious studies course, is to help you understand. And this is not a comparative religion course, which a lot of state courses are. In our courses, we actually deal with specific religious traditions. For instance, if you want to study about Islam, you won't take a course with me, because I know quite a bit about Islam, but I don't know enough to be able to really introduce you to the thought forms and to the real feel of Islam. So we have a Muslim scholar who teaches the Islamic course, and again, he's not trying to convert you to Islam. He's trying to help you to understand Islam. And I personally would rather take a course in Islam from a Muslim than from a Baptist. It's not because I don't like Baptists, it's just because I want to hear from someone who is thoroughly acquainted, and maybe even a participant, though that's not essential. But possibly a participant. So when I teach a course in Bible or in Christian, or the history of Christianity, or in Christian ethics, I'm going to be very forthright in trying to help you to understand what Christian ethics is. You don't have to agree with anything I say in order to make an A in this course. You might, for instance, one of these days take a course in communism, and you might never agree with the basic premise of anything that you study. But the purpose of taking that course is to understand. And so that's what we're doing. The course is described as a study of the nature and history of ethics in a Christian context. This course will explore the nature of ethics in the biblical, that is, the Jewish Christian tradition, by surveying the history of ethics beginning with the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. The ethical thought of specific exemplars in the history of Christian thought will be examined. Contemporary ethical issues, including issues of personal, social, and political ethics, will be considered. A consideration of Christian participation in the construction of a public ethic will also be considered and will conclude the study. Now, when I first started teaching religious studies here, I developed a course and did not include the Bible as one of the textbooks, because I generally allow people to use whatever standard translation of the Bible they have to look up the biblical references and do the biblical reading. But when I first presented this course to the faculty, a crusty old professor who was not religious at all bawled me out for not listing the Bible as one of the textbooks, and I had to assure him that I was going to teach the Bible, because he understood, even though he was not a religious person himself, that it is very difficult to be educated without understanding something about the Bible. It's certainly impossible to be educated very much about Western culture without understanding the Bible. And all of the ethical discussions that are going on right now, for instance, that go on every day in our political process, it's very important to understand the history of the Bible and the history of Christian ethics in order to understand what's going on in those discussions. Because Christianity, I don't use the language Christianity is a Christian nation, because I think that's illegitimate. I think that's illegitimate sociologically, historically, and theologically. It's hard for any nation to be a Christian nation and really take Christianity seriously, because politics and national self-interest are always requiring compromises, political compromises, and so forth. And so it's really very difficult for a Christian to be serious about his faith and his ethics and to participate in society at large. You have to have an ethical framework from which to do that. And the United States is a pluralistic country. It is no longer made up just of Christians. And so that's the reason why there is always, in present political discussions, the problem of how Christian ethics, which still exists among Americans, how Christian ethics should be related to public policy and so forth. One of the things that I want you to do, let me tell you three things that I want you to do in terms of the work to be submitted for this course. One of the things I want you to do, which you may not have heard about so far, is I want you to keep a scrapbook. Now, you can go to the newspaper every day, in a newspaper as big as the Houston Chronicle, and find several articles on subjects that have to do with ethical decisions. there were ethical questions and moral questions and religious questions that came up all the way through the presidential race that occurred a while back. And there are ethical questions that arose during confirmation of various people that were selected. Not only ethical but religious questions. And we're going to have to try to see the relationship between ethics and religion, because there is no necessary relationship between traditional religion and ethics. And that's a point that a lot of people make, and that is that the United States cannot base its laws directly on any particular religious perspective. And so there has to be a kind of a consensus in a nation or in a republic of basic ethical values which are not specifically or directly related to any particular religious background. On the other hand, there is no nation in which its ethics and its laws are not in some way influenced by religious traditions. If you are living in a Western country that has had the impact of 2,000 years of Christian history, then the laws that govern that country and the values and the ethics that a great many people in that country subscribe to are going to be influenced by the biblical worldview, the biblical vision of the nature of human beings, the nature of reality, and it's going to be influenced by the history of Christian ethics. Now that's true. That would be true even if all America in a generation or two became agnostic or secular or completely atheistic. A great deal of their ethical worldview would still have come about because their ancestors were Jews and Christians. The same thing would happen in a Muslim country. And if you travel to a Muslim country, you have to understand that if religion has any power whatsoever, it's going to have the power to mold and to shape the cultural and ethical ways in which people operate. And so if you go into a Muslim country, Muslim countries have different ways of relating to Muslim ethics and Muslim culture. But if you go into a Muslim country, you better try to understand a little bit about what you're doing. One of the problems that the United States has had for decades is that they've operated on, our government has operated under the assumption that all public policy and all public discussion should be on a secular level. Well, that means you can't understand the policies of most people in the world, because most people in the world do not operate totally on a secular level. And so we've had a hard time over the decades, and because some of our diplomats and ambassadors and so forth were really fairly uneducated about the religious backgrounds to the culture which they were dealing with. A lot of problems have developed out of that probably shouldn't have developed. That's one of the problems of the UN. The UN was established in the United States basically by people with a liberal Christian ethic. And a great many of the founders, almost all the founders, and a great many of the presidents or secretaries of the United Nations have been Christian people. Some of them very intense Christian people. But since it's the United Nations, what the United Nations does is to try to influence more of a general culture. For instance, on human rights. What human rights means depends upon your theology, and on your understanding of the nature of God, on your understanding of the nature of human beings. Now, that means that when the United Nations gets together, especially when it was getting together the first few decades, people are talking across the table who have hundreds or thousands of years of different historical traditions. And those different historical traditions have produced different ethical visions or visions of what human beings should be. For instance, American democracy comes out of a particular ethical tradition. That doesn't mean that you can't have democracies in other countries, but it does mean that those democracies will probably look different, because there are just certain aspects of, say, British democracy or French democracy or American democracy, all of which depend to a certain extent on the biblical Christian understanding of nature, along with other influences. But certainly it's been influenced by the Christian understanding of humanity, what a human being is, and so forth. But even British democracy and American democracy will have different castes, even though we speak the same language, and our democracies both arose primarily out of Puritanism and later Puritan liberalism. There are still differences in the culture and in the democratic process as it occurs in England and America. That's certainly going to be true when you're dealing, for instance, with a democracy in Japan. Now, Japanese democracy is interesting because it was created kind of instantaneously by American military people. In other words, once Japan was conquered, and it was believed by American policymakers and the American military that unless there was a kind of an imposition, that's a case where democracy has been imposed from without, unless there was kind of an imposition upon Japanese society of democratic principles, then they might revert back to militarism. And so, for that reason, Japanese democracy from the very beginning was a study in American democracy. And the same thing about the Japanese work ethic. The Japanese work ethic, which has become so powerful in recent decades, a lot of that arose out of the work ethic being taken over there by American missionaries, not religious people, but American missionaries of the work ethic. And what they did was to pick up on the Puritan work ethic and do it better than we do. And so, but anyway, that's an isolated case. On the other hand, if you're talking about democracy in Indonesia or in Vietnam, you're going to see a very different thing. And a great deal of the difference will depend upon your religious and ethical heritage. So that's the reason for the importance of the study of religion of all kinds, and that's also extremely important for the understanding or the study of religion. That makes the study of Christian ethics very important. And so, as I say, it makes no difference for this course what your particular religious background is, but it is kind of important for Christians to understand something about their own religious background, because we're now in a situation where a great many people, even people who go to church every Sunday, really almost know nothing about their own religious tradition. You run into Roman Catholics or Baptists or Presbyterians or Episcopalians who consider themselves religious and kind of have a religious atmosphere about their thinking, but know almost nothing about how those religious ideas arose or how they are justified, and that's true also about ethics. There are a great many ethical fights that have happened in the United States over the last few years, not least of which is, for instance, the abortion issue. In the last presidential campaign, as probably in every presidential campaign in the future, if the world lasts long enough, will introduce the subject of abortion. Now, I don't look this old, I know, but I first voted in 1960 for president. And the abortion issue was not an issue in 1960, even though that was the first time that a Roman Catholic was elected to the presidency. There were some religious issues involved there. For instance, people wondered if Kennedy would bring certain aspects of European Catholicism into his decision making. And at the time, there was a great deal of anti-Catholic sentiment in America. And one Catholic candidate, in fact, had lost earlier primarily because he was a Roman Catholic. And so Kennedy had to kind of overcome that. And he did it largely by, for instance, attending a ministers' conference here in Houston at the Astrodome, where, I don't remember where it was. May not have been the Astrodome, maybe not have, but it was some large community building here in Houston where ministers came to primarily kind of try to shoot him down, try to find out whether he was going to be really believe in the separation of church and state, because Catholicism in other countries was not particularly inclined to the separation of church and state. And Kennedy generally convinced them that he was. In fact, Kennedy campaigned against federal aid to parochial schools. The candidate that campaigned in favor of federal aid to parochial schools was Nixon. And so you had a kind of reversal there, because Kennedy couldn't possibly have campaigned for aid to parochial schools without scaring people. Whereas Nixon, since he was a Quaker, and Quakers are basically totally church separationists, then Nixon could do something or run for something that Kennedy could not. That was an interesting ethical issue that took place in that. But the abortion issue didn't arise then because it wasn't an issue. If it had arisen, it would have arisen because some presidential candidate had run on a pro-abortion plank. And if in 1960 he had run on a pro-abortion plank, he would not have had a chance of being elected. That's how much the issue or the ethical issue of abortion has changed since 1960. There wasn't a Democrat or a Republican who could have gotten elected based on Roe versus Wade. Whereas today, it's hard for someone who is in opposition to Roe versus Wade to be considered a viable candidate. And so that's the kind of issue that we're going to be dealing with, and why this drastic development has taken place in America. Whereas 30 years ago, 40 years ago, a person could not have been elected if he had been what we today call pro-choice. Whereas these days, it's sometimes hard to get elected if you're not pro-choice. And certainly, it still looms very large in the public debate. But everybody can't be neutral. In fact, there's nobody that's really neutral. So when somebody says, for instance, when Joseph Lieberman, when he was running for vice president, made the point that he believed that ethics had to arise out of religious faith, he was severely criticized for that. Well, he didn't change his mind because he's an Orthodox Jew. And that's his experience, that his ethics arise out of his Orthodox Jewish faith. What they may have been criticizing him for is trying to push his Orthodox Jewish faith onto people who are not Orthodox Jews. But he clearly said that he wasn't going to try to do that. But he was also clearly saying that as an Orthodox Jew, he could not run for vice president without being honest about the fact that it is Orthodox Judaism that gives him his primary way of looking at the world, gives his primary way of looking at things like human rights and religious freedom and so forth. And the Constitution says there can be no religious test for a public office. What that means is not that nobody who's religious can run for public office, What it means is that you can't keep a person from running for public office because of his religion, no matter how extreme it might be. And in a democracy, what that means is that the voting populace simply has to listen to these people and decide whether they want to vote for them. Because there can't be any law against them running. There can't be any law against them serving. So they then put themselves within the political process. But the idea that a presidential candidate can run, or you can find a presidential candidate to run that does not have some influence in his life and in the way he thinks by his religious background, is just nonsense. In the American democracy, there has to be a tension between a person's religious background and his public service. But you can't get rid of that. You can't get rid of that. And so the issue, for instance, of abortion, a lot of people say, well, that's not a moral question. And a lot of other people say, well, it's a moral question, but it shouldn't be a moral question. In other words, somebody shouldn't be trying to force their morality, that is, their opposition to abortion, on people. Well, that's true. But people who are pro-abortion are also standing for a moral principle. And it's, in other words, it's their moral principle. It's a moral principle that's come out of their way of interpreting the nature of human beings and the nature of reality. So whichever moral position wins is going to take a democratic process to decide. And what has finally happened in the United States basically is pro-choice basically tries to neutralize abortion as a moral issue by giving people choice. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people who are opposed to abortion, because they are Americans and the American law allows choice, that they should necessarily be required to back off from their very deeply held views on abortion. Because you can't do that. You can't do that to a person. A person's religious perspective and his ethical perspective, whether it is secular humanism or whether it is Pentecostalism or Catholicism or whatever, Judaism, he can't separate himself from that. You can separate church from state, but even that's a very difficult thing to do. But you can't separate religion from culture. And you certainly can't separate an individual Christian or an individual Muslim or an individual atheist or an individual Baptist from his particular religious perspective. You have to understand that going in. Now, the course objectives in this course, if we look at the monitor, to understand how the development of thought has influenced Christian ethics. Christian ethics is obviously rooted in the biblical story. But from the very beginning, Christian ethics also was in dialogue with ethics that people already had. And that's one of the things that makes Christian ethics so complicated. Because Christian ethics does not just produce a rule book, and then you can go to that rule book. The Bible is not a rule book. It contains some principles, some rules that are given in the context of the Bible story. For instance, the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are not an objective set of rules. The Ten Commandments are rules only for people who are in covenant with the God of the Ten Commandments. Now, they might appeal to other people, and they certainly have in Western history. Generally, at least until recently, the Ten Commandments were actually put in law in some places. Even the observance of the Sabbath day, sometimes in Christian history, has been made a law. Certainly, there used to be laws in America against adultery, There's no more laws against that now. But there's always been this dialogical relationship between secular society, or between the society at large, and Christian ideas. And Christian ideals have never won completely in this exchange or in this dialogue. In the New Testament, for instance, even though Paul, in his writings, believes that he has a very important ethical way of understanding the relationship between a man and his wife that comes out of the ethics of Jesus, or the teachings of Jesus, comes out of the basic Christian theme of love, agape, which we're going to talk about as we go along. That means, for instance, that when Paul talks about a husband and a wife, he makes a statement which was outrageous to people in all cultures at the time. That is, that a husband should love his wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself. In other words, a husband's love to his wife should be an unconditional love, one that protects her and takes care of her and does what is best for her. And that was an outrageous statement for a Roman husband who basically had absolute dictatorial control over his wife and over his children. It wasn't illegal. If a Roman father got up in the morning, not many of them did this, I'm sure, but if a Roman father got up in the morning and for some reason decided that his child needed to be killed, that might happen, and nobody would call the police because he had that kind of power, he had that control over his family. Paul, on the other hand, thinks that the natural way, or the ordinary way in which people, men particularly, related to their wives, because it was patriarchal society, and men believed in all cultures just about that the husband was the one who had just complete autocracy over the family and over the wife. And so Paul is radically changing that by saying that a husband has to treat his wife in a radically different way because of Jesus. In other words, he's pointing to Christ. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the family structure that existed in the culture was done away with. Because what happened usually is that Christianity did not go in and completely overthrow the mores and the morals and the moral structure of a society where it went. It went in and transformed these morals. That's a problem a lot of people have with reading the Bible, for instance, because even though the abolition of slavery eventually arose out of the biblical view of human beings, there is nothing in the Bible, in the New Testament, that says Christians ought to be out trying to abolish slavery, because that was simply not a cultural, social, political, or ethical option at the time. So what the Christians did was to try to transform the relationship between people who were slaves and people who were not slaves. It wasn't, in fact, until later kinds of slavery, for instance, African slavery, where slavery became so obviously inhuman and destructive of any possibly good human relationships, that Christians were able eventually to abolish slavery. But its primary goal, Christian ethics' primary goal, is to transform the meaning and the nature and the quality of human relationships. That means that a Christian can be a good Christian and live in a Muslim society. He doesn't have to have a Christian president. a person can be a good Christian and live in a communist society. Whether or not he gets involved in some kind of revolutionary movement in that society, of course, is an ethical decision he has to make. But he can still transform all of his relationships and recommend the transformation of relationships on the basis of Christian ethics, wherever he is. And so, one of the things that we want to emphasize is the dialogue between Christian ethics and the cultural mores. And sometimes philosophical ethics have influenced Christian ethics. Certainly cultural ethics have influenced Christian ethics. Sometimes that's been absolutely necessary, inevitable. Sometimes that has been detrimental to Christian ethics. For instance, Christian ethics for the first 300 years was absolutely pacifist, which means that the Christians didn't have to worry about whether they were being unchristian by going out and having a war with their neighbors. They just didn't participate in that. Later, when Christians actually became the governors of society, then Christian ethicists began to rethink what is the relationship between Christianity and war. And generally there developed a concept of a just war. That is, it's possible for Christians to actually express their love by defending people who have been unjustly aggressed upon or unjustly oppressed. And so that tension in Christian ethics has continued to exist all the way through. And both pacifism and just war theory have generally been considered in the history of Christian ethics as two legitimate ways of expressing Christian love, even though the different sides will obviously argue about which is more legitimate. So, history, philosophy, culture, Christianity is always in dialogue with these things, and that's what will bring about changes. Changes in the situation, for instance, in the relationship between men and women, will bring about some changes in the way love is expressed in relationship. We also want to understand how Christian ethics has influenced social and moral interpretation, not just how it's been influenced by its culture, but how it has actually been a major part of the establishment of an ethical culture. What is the relationship, for instance, between Christian ethics and the abolition of slavery? Well, there's a direct relationship. What's the relationship between Christian ethics and the civil rights movement in America? There is a direct relationship. All of the abolitionists in England and America were evangelical Christians, that is, Christians who took their ethics seriously. A lot of slave owners, in fact most slave owners in England and America, also called themselves Christians. But the abolitionists assumed that these Christians were not being true to their ethics. And so that was the basis upon which they objected to slavery, and they eventually won because slavery was abolished. The Marxist interpretation, this goes to the matter of interpretation, the Marxist interpretation is that slavery was abolished because of economic reasons. And you can probably still go to classes at the university here in which the primary interpretation of the abolition of slavery is that it came because of economic reasons or because of some philosophical liberalization. But that would come as news to the abolitionists because they were all committed Christians, and it wasn't until they were able to influence a critical mass of people that there was even the possibility of slavery being abolished, because people like slavery. They like to have slaves. They don't like to be slaves themselves, but they like to have slaves. Yes. Yeah, just punch that button.
Do you feel that, biblically speaking, that people felt that Moses the story of Moses had anything to do with abolishing slavery?
Yes. In fact, we'll talk about the concept of covenant, which is what the story of Moses is about. The story of Moses is about a covenant that God makes with a group of people who are slaves in Egypt. They weren't exactly slaves the same way Africans were slaves, but they were still an underclass in Egypt. And the whole story of Israel is the Israel of the rescue is the story of the rescue of a people that God has chosen to be His people, not because of their moral superiority, but in a sense God chooses these people despite whether they're morally superior or not, in order to be His people, in order to, in a sense, educate them in what it means to be related to this God. So the covenant that is made by Moses on Mount Sinai is kind of like a marriage covenant. In other words, I am your God. I'm the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. And if I am your God, this is the way you will act. And then He gives them the commandments. This is the way you will act. In other words, the Ten Commandments are not rationalistic, philosophically developed morality. They are morality that comes from the Word of God, according to the Bible. And they are all dealing with how human beings treat God and how they treat fellow human beings. And they're all based on the character of God. If God does not want people to be tortured and killed and oppressed, if God is not torturing and killing and oppressing you, if He wants you to be, if He wants you to live life, and if He wants you to be free, and if He wants you to be to participate in the goodness of life and so forth, then that's what He expects you to do in relationship to other people. In other words, all ethics really is, all Jewish and Christian ethics really is social ethics. There are some personal aspects to it, but the personal aspects have to do with how you relate to other people. So in the abolitionist movement then, the story of the Exodus and the story of the covenant was the primary story that these people used to try to convince other people who call themselves Christians that this was anti-biblical. It was anti-Christian to continue this slave relationship. And the same thing is true with the Civil Rights Movement. Just about all of the original participants in the Civil Rights Movement were preachers. Most of them were Baptist preachers. And if you read their speeches, almost all of them refer some way or another to the Exodus story and to the idea of God's people coming out of bondage and coming out of slavery. So that's the way Christian ethics has influenced specific moral questions and moral situations. In other words, it wasn't doing any good just for somebody to get up and say, now y'all ought to be real good and not have any, not oppress anybody. You know, you can get up and say that all day long, but unless there's some kind of vision, unless there's some kind of moral imperative that you can communicate, then not much is going to happen. Another objective is to critically examine contemporary theories on the relationship between Christianity and ethics. Here again, the Civil Rights Movement is an interesting example, because the Civil Rights Movement actually began theoretically, intellectually, in Christian seminaries, such as Union Seminary and Yale Seminary and Harvard Seminary. But it was translated into social reality, policy reality, when people like Martin Luther King studied at these seminaries and realized that it was not necessary simply to allow themselves to be oppressed. That that was actually against the true ethic of the oppressors. In other words, if the oppressors could be shown that their oppression was actually in contradiction to their own, supposedly their own ethical perspective, then something could happen. And interestingly enough, the civil rights movement, as we'll also see, was influenced by another religious perspective, and that was the religious perspective of Mahatma Gandhi. And it's from Mahatma Gandhi that Martin Luther King and the theologians in Union Seminary and other places saw, because Gandhi had done it, saw how that nonviolent resistance, and Christians generally have a bias against violent resistance, and so that's the reason why nothing was really happening, even though there were a lot of Christians who saw that all of these laws were wrong and that the way people were being treated were wrong. They just kind of went along to go along, and people were kind of told, well, you know, you're suffering in this life, but when you die and go to heaven, then you'll be okay. Well, people like John Wesley said you can't get away with that. If God does not want slaves in heaven, then you can't justify having slaves on earth. And if God wants people to be glorified and fulfilled and free in heaven, then you can't justify as a Christian keeping them in bondage or in oppression below. Gandhi, interestingly enough, had himself been influenced by Jesus. So you can't understand Gandhi without understanding Christian ethics. Gandhi said that he would have been a Christian except for the way Christians acted. Well, that's understandable. You know, he came into contact with Christianity when he was a lawyer in South Africa, and he imbibed a lot of the ethic of Jesus, which is not a natural ethic. There's nothing natural about resisting non-violently. You know, when somebody is beating you and sicking dogs on you and even assassinating you, there's nothing natural about just not reacting against that violently. And many times Martin Luther King had to kind of call his people into order because sometimes they were reacting violently. And his belief was that that through Christian ethics, as modified to a certain extent by Gandhi's experience, you could bring about a moral crisis in the minds of the majority population. Just like a moral crisis was brought into the minds of the British, because the British always conceived of themselves as sophisticated, humanistic Christian people. And when they saw what it took to put down the resistance of the Indian movement, when it saw the brutality and the inhumanity of what British troops and British officers did in trying to put this down, that basically ended it for the British people. And Martin Luther King said, well, that possibly is the same way it would end in America. If America, and that's exactly what happened, America watches television and sees people being chased by dogs and being beaten, and even sees stories of people being brutalized and tortured and murdered, and that was the power of nonviolent resistance. But nonviolent resistance was somewhat different in the modern world, say, from the kind of passive resistance that Jesus and the early church had, because the political situation was different. You couldn't go out and vote for your choice in New Testament times. The idea of voting for for Caesar just did not compute. There wasn't anything from their perspective. Caesar was Caesar, and there wasn't anything Christians can do about it. So what they had to do was simply live as best they could in their culture. But by the time of the abolitionist movement and the civil rights movement, there were so many people who considered themselves Christians that they couldn't stand it, that a Christian view of relationships could not be put into practice in society. And that's the reason why democracy arose. That's the reason why the labor movement arose. That's the reason why the human rights movement and the abolitionist movement and the opposition to child labor and all of these things came out of the ethics of Christian people. And a lot of people adopted them, and a lot of people around the world are adopting them still today. But, slavery was only abolished officially in the United Nations in 1975 because a majority of the constituency of the United Nations had to be persuaded, and it took several decades to persuade them that it'd be in the best interest of the world to abolish slavery. Now, that didn't mean that slavery was really abolished, because slavery still exists in a lot of these countries. But at least it was legally abolished in 1975, and that's another secular result of the previous influence of biblical ethics, Christian ethics. Now, what we're going to see throughout this course is that the basic theme by which we understand the meaning of Christ in the world is the concept of Christian love. So your first paper, which will also be similar to a midterm, your first paper will be an analysis of what is Christian love. Since it's the central theme of Christian ethics, what is it? The word love can mean almost anything. We can talk about, I love mashed potatoes, I love my grandmother, I love rock music, or I love hillbilly music. And all of those words mean different things. I love my child, I love my wife. Those are different ways of using the word love. And so we may be confused about what is commanded in Christian ethics when Christians are commanded to love one another, to love your enemy, to love your neighbor as yourself. What is the content of that love? It could be just a feeling. We always go around saying, oh, I love this or I love that. And what we mean by that is that something is very attractive to us and it gives us pleasure. But Christian love is love for something that may not be attractive to you. It is a love for someone who may not be attractive to you. Loving enemies is a contradictory idea if you interpret love as just a feeling of attraction. Because if you love your enemy that way, then he's not your enemy. You may love your enemy and he still remain your enemy. And there still may be very difficult problems between you. But loving that enemy means to do something or to treat him in a certain way. It doesn't mean just to feel in a certain way. It means to treat him in a certain way. So when Jesus says to love one another, he's commanding you to do something. And I cannot command you, nobody can command you to love your girlfriend. Did somebody have to command you to love your boyfriend or your husband or your wife? Nobody had to command you to do that in that sense, because that is an erotic love. That's a love of attraction. But some men do have to be commanded to love their wives in the Christian sense. because a lot of men may have very erotic love relationship with a woman and yet treat her rotten. And so when Paul says for a husband to love his wife, he's talking about love in a more transcendent way than just a feeling of attraction. And when Jesus said love one another, he says, as I have loved you. That means that what love means depends upon your conception of God. And a broader way of saying that is what your ethics are based on your view of God. If you don't have a view of God, then your ethics are based on that. But if you have a view of God, then your ethics are based on your view of God. At least what ethics should be. That doesn't necessarily mean that people live up to what their ethics should be. Yes?
So what exactly are you looking for with the concept of Christian love? Would it be on all our religious belief about God, or would it be on textbook-wise or at the personal level?
Yeah, what you need to do is read these texts. In other words, you're immediately going to be reading and thinking about the concept of Christian love. If that's the basic theme of Christian ethics, then that will be the basic theme of these books. And so as you begin to read, all of the authors, when they deal with this subject of Christian love, will try to say some of the things that I've already said. That is, that we have to learn the meaning of words. You can't do anything well intellectually if you don't come to some conclusion about the meaning of the words you're using. And ethics basically is an intellectual activity in which you are examining the bases and the justification of your moral activity. You know, sometimes you can use ethics and morality interchangeably. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that when it comes to a study of ethics, you kind of have to distinguish between morality and ethics. Morality is what you do. Ethics is you're thinking about morality and trying to figure out what the basis of morality is and what you should do. And that means that ethics in Christian faith has to be related to theology, because we're not going to know what love is without understanding the nature of God or the nature of Christ. Let me just read, beginning in page 1, from Paul Ramsey's book on basic Christian ethics, which is going to be our basic text. Now let me just tell you a little bit about the book first, and let me put it over here where people can see it. Basic Christian Ethics by Paul Ramsey is a kind of a standard text throughout most of the latter half of the 20th century. That was used in seminaries and in graduate schools, Harvard and Yale and all of these places that taught courses on Christian ethics. And since we've picked out one person to read, that means that we've had to eliminate thousands of other people. And so there's no way you can pick out one person and he be totally adequate to the subject. But Paul Ramsey does do a great job of setting up the questions that you're dealing with Christian ethics, and also examining the major theme of Christian ethics and examining the relationship between ethics and your religious faith or your theology. And so that's the reason why we're using his book as kind of the basic ethical book. And on page 1 he says, the first thing to be said concerning Christian ethics is that it cannot be separated from its religious foundation. One of the best the most theological page in the newspaper is the cartoon section. And several cartoons are actually written by theologians. For instance, Peanuts was written for all those years by a Church of God theologian. And so a great deal of what Peanuts has to say is it comes out of the theological and ethical views of Charles Schulz. And he was always dealing with questions of Christian ethics. And one I remember specifically, Lucy is bothering Charlie Brown, and she's just kind of screaming at him, "Charlie Brown, you should love mankind. You should love mankind. You should love mankind." That's a kind of a moralistic approach to ethics. That is, if you just tell people what they're supposed to do, then they'll do it. And Charlie Brown's answer was, "I love mankind. It's just the people I can't stand." Well, you see, his concept of the love of mankind had a certain content, and that's the way lots of people love mankind. You know, if you ask the average person on the street, "Do you love mankind?" Oh yeah, they love mankind, but they might kick their wife when they get home. They might steal something from their neighbor as soon as they get home, and they might cheat somebody or actually physically assault somebody. But from their perspective, they have this kind of pious feeling, "Oh yeah, I love mankind, but they don't treat me right, so I'm not going to treat them right," you know. So it's just the people you can't stand. Well, that's what Charles Schulz was trying to say is that the Christian concept of love takes into consideration that there are people you can't stand. If there weren't people that you couldn't stand, then there would be no need to command love. You would just love people automatically. If you liked them, you know, if you were attracted to them, if they were attractive to you, either physically attractive or attractive because of their personality or whatever. They're just some people who, because of the way they were born, the way they were raised, and the way they've been related to their environment, that are just ugly, personally. You understand what I'm saying? It's very difficult to feel attracted to them. And there's some of these people that have actually become extremely powerful people in the history of the world. And they have harmed, sometimes murdered with genocide, millions of people. You can't love that person naturally. If you love that person, it's going to have to be a kind of a supernatural activity. It's going to have to be commanded. And so there are a lot of stories in the newspaper these days, which might be one of the things that you collect in your little scrapbook. There are a lot of stories these days about people forgiving other people. Forgiveness has become kind of a topic du jour these days. Especially people forgiving people who have hurt them or have raped them or have killed even some of their kinfolks. There are stories, of course, of people going down and sitting and watching somebody be executed, and saying that's what they get. But there are also stories of people who don't want their rapist or the person who's murdered their friend to be executed. They want to forgive them, and that is not a natural thing to do. That's not a natural thing to do. It can only come about if these people are, as Ramsey says, participating in obedient love. That is, they are treating a person not the way he should be treated. Because if you treat him the way he should be treated, he probably ought to get fried. But you're treating someone in the way Christ has treated you. So that's what gives Christian ethics its content. So that means something different from loving mashed potatoes. To love someone, for instance, who has raped you, And I've never been raped, so I can't make any kind of ethical decision for anybody that has been. But the fact that there are some people who have been raped or they've had some of their loved ones killed who are still able to forgive is a kind of a small, not a small, but a kind of a reflection of an element of Christian love which is not seen very often, at least publicly. So, Christian ethics cannot be separated from its religious foundation. How would I know to forgive my enemy or forgive somebody who has hurt me if it did not have some connection with my religious perspective on the nature of God and the nature of human being? This is true not because of some tender-minded belief in supernatural sanctions are needed to enforce right conduct. That's what a lot of people think of Christian ethics, that Christians are just supposed to kind of get in control of the society and force their ethics on the society. One of the several of the issues that are now in the newspapers every day, for instance, have to do with how homosexual people should be treated. And there are several issues related to that. One is, what is the Christian or biblical attitude toward homosexuality itself? And another is, what is the Christian biblical attitude toward homosexual activity, which are not necessarily the same things. But then after you've studied that, you still have the question of, well, even if you have this particular view of what homosexuality is, what should your view about the rights of homosexuals to have jobs, to live their lives in peace, be protected from abuse and from violence and so forth? In other words, there's no one question in the question of homosexuality. There are all these kinds of questions. And Christianity does not provide supernatural sanctions to enforce right conduct. The fact that God requires something of a human being and stands ready to reward obedience and punish violations is not nearly so important as the question to what sort of God man has obligations. Your God may be a God who is perfectly willing for you to get an axe and go kill somebody because he is a member of a different religion. There must be lots of people in the world who have a God like that, because that happens every day. That happens every day. And you can read about that in the newspapers. People who take machetes out, and it's been happening in Indonesia all week. People taking machetes out and cutting people, killing people, chopping them to death because they're of a different religion. Well, that means that your concept of God is extremely important, because your concept of God is going to be the content of the way that you treat people. On the other hand, it's possible to have a concept of God in which God would be infuriated with you if you took a machete out and killed somebody just because he was of another faith. So the concept of who God is essential to understanding religious ethics. God has something to do with the very meaning of obligation. He is no merely external threat standing behind morality. The ethics of Jesus, for instance, cannot be understood without some understanding of the God of Abraham. You got to go back and read that story. How does God relate to Abraham? The God of Isaac and Jacob, the God of Moses and the prophets. One way, the most essential way in which God relates to Abraham, Moses, and all these people is through love, the Old Testament equivalent of love. Because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, if you read their lives, one of the things that is very obvious is that they don't deserve to be considered heroes of morality. They are not chosen because they are heroes of morality. They're chosen because God loves them, and He wants to try to make them maybe into heroes of morality, or make them into what God wants them to be. But He doesn't love Abraham because Abraham is such an outstandingly righteous and sinless person. He's not. So you have to read those stories. Read the story of David. David was an adulterer. He murdered the husband of the woman he had an adultery with. He was guilty of what we today would call war crimes, which was the reason why he was not allowed to build the temple. Now, David is one of the great heroes of the Old Testament, but it's obvious that David's relationship to God had to be one in which God loved someone who did not necessarily do anything to deserve love. Biblical writers do not view ethics naturalistically, as rooted in human nature or in the social environment, or abstractly in terms of some generalizations about human values. They view ethics theologically as rooted in the nature and the activity of God. If you don't know who your God is, or if you have a confused view of God, then you could be a very dangerous person. You know, the people, for instance, who did the Spanish Inquisition. You say, well, those people were believers in the Christian God, and look what they did. Well, you need to analyze that a little bit more. If you see what they did, then you should be able to extrapolate from that what they thought about God. And what they thought about God was not too cool. What they thought about God was not very profound. They actually thought that God was in favor of this Inquisition. And so they did it. They did the Inquisition, and before that they carried on crusades, thinking that they were doing God's will. Well, it takes a particular conception of God to justify the crusades, and to justify the Inquisition, and to justify witch hunts, and to justify violence against homosexuals or anybody else. It takes a certain concept of God. If a Christian, for instance, talking about homosexual people, and I just use that as an example because that's one of the issues that is ongoing. If a Christian talking about a homosexual person sounds just like an atheist that's sitting down in a bar getting drunk, then there's something wrong with his conception of God. If a Christian talks about an African American the same way a guy down in the bar with a sheet on talks about him, then there's something wrong with his conception of God. So, biblical writers do not view ethics naturalistically. They view ethics theologically as rooted in the nature and the activity of God. As a consequence, man's relation to God was thought to be of vital importance, not simply for ethics, but within ethical theory itself. So, do not expect, if you're studying Christian ethics, do not expect to study ethics in a kind of a rationalistic, philosophical way. You may have to do that in order to get along with your culture and be able to relate Christian ethics to your culture. But first, Christian ethics needs to be sure about itself. Needs to be sure about itself. In other words, a Christian ethicist might come to the conclusion that in order to be fair, Roe versus Wade might be the law of the land. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he is required then to come to the conclusion that abortion is Christianly justifiable. There are different ways of dealing with that subject. Now, I appreciate the questions that have been asked today. I hope that as you do more of your reading, you will formulate more questions, and that you will bring them to class with you, and even if I don't touch the subject, still ask those questions. Thank you.